my readers for most things. I'll start because I probably have more stuff that I can cover in 30 minutes. That's my claim to fame. But what I thought I'd do today, and hi to everybody I know, hello, and nice to meet you to anyone I don't know. I'm a neuropsychologist here at Children's National. As Ben said, I have been involved with NF and our oncology group for pretty much the 20 years I've been here. So it's been a real blessing to get to know families and the kids, and it's what makes me excited to come here every day. What I thought I'd do today is a little bit different. I realized that, we had a lot of research protocols here, both in neuropsychology and outside of neuropsychology, and I feel like we probably don't do the best job at showing back what we're learning from all the time that the families and the children here at Children's and other places, but particularly here, which you helped us learn. So this is focused specifically in protocols that we have in neuropsychology, but I'm going to spend the next half hour kind of sharing with you what we're learning, what's upcoming in the world of learning and cognition. There you go. I already said that. So I was going to start with one of our studies that this was certainly not just at Children's, but I'm really proud of this work. But, we have obviously the excitement about MEK inhibitors, and predominantly that surrounds the work that's been done in showing the response of tumors to these types of drugs. So fortunately, because I've been around long enough that I have a lot of good colleagues at other places, we were able to attach a cognitive protocol to these treatment studies, because there was some evidence in mice with NF1 that perhaps this could alter cognition or learning, as well as have an impact on tumors. But we didn't know. This really could go either way. So we were able to attach a protocol to those studies so that we could learn a little bit about, if these drugs like MEK inhibitors, like imatinib, et cetera, might have some kind of impact on cognition. So we published this paper, and I'll just give you kind of a high-level overview of what we found. Don't worry too much about all that's here. But what I'll summarize is that we followed kids from before they started treatment to 6 months and 12 months into treatment. And we assessed how they were doing in two ways. One is with one of the many questionnaires that you all probably have done for us over the years, called the BRIEF, which is something that measures executive function, so short-term memory, planning and organization, monitoring your abilities and how you're doing. And this graph represents that questionnaire and what parents rated their children on through the course of the study. What we really learned, and the highlight of this, is that for those kids that entered the study with problems in executive function, we found that over that 6 and 12 months, half and then 71% of those kids showed significant improvement in the parent ratings of executive function once they were on these MEK inhibitors. I will caveat this to say, this is not just, I don't want anybody leaving here saying, I want to go get my kid on a MEK inhibitor for cognition. We are nowhere near that statement yet. This is really preliminary to understand if there's even some what we call signal to suggest that we should keep studying this, that maybe there's potential. But you can see in I don't know if I have a pointer, but you can see in the bars on the right, those are kids that did not have executive function problems when they entered the study. So in those kids, you see many less of them in that green bar that showed improvement. The other way that we evaluated these outcomes is through a test that we administered to the children, so on working memory. And similarly, although not quite as strong, you can see, though, that those kids, again, that showed that they had difficulties with that before they entered the MEK inhibitor study were the ones that showed us in 6 and 12 months, more of them showed a significant improvement in their performance. There's no comparison group here, so we don't know if every kid that has an impairment would show an improvement afterwards, in this test performance or these ratings. So that's definitely a limitation to this. We do have an ongoing study through the Children's Oncology Group now for kids with NF1 that have also low-grade gliomas, where there is a comparison group. So we'll learn more about this, and we'll have more to say about this as time goes on. But that is one thing that we've been working on. So we were the first to look at any human trials in NF1 with MEK inhibitors and cognition. The one thing I think that we were able to say is that, so neurotoxicity means a drug has an impact on the brain, and it impacts how the brain functions, and it can then impact cognition. We were able to say that we did not see any significant number of children show a decrease in performance or worsening of problems in that time. So we have some confidence that this is not having a negative impact on brain function in these kids. So that's important. Most parents would like to know that. Again, this gives us some information to target this and really keep looking at this. So again, this is not a recommendation to treat your child with a MEK inhibitor if they don't need it for other reasons, but we'll see where this takes us. So the next study that I wanted to share some results on is what we call the cognitive overload study. And I think one of the things that we realize and we hear a lot is that our kids with NF1 get overwhelmed quite easily. Mostly in school, but that can even be in social situations, at home. And this usually creates some outbursts and behaviors that kind of maybe not everybody understands. That's really driven by just being overwhelmed with all the things. So this usually comes from difficulties with executive function, again, short-term memory, being able to plan and organize things, especially in our, school-age kiddos. So we decided that we really wanted to try to understand this concept of cognitive overload. This is not new, and actually in the school system, they don't talk about it much, but a lot of teachers are trained to kind of reduce load and reduce cognitive load when teaching. So there are actually strategies for how we can work with kids where cognitive overload is an issue. And it has to, there's multiple factors, but it has to do with how we present materials, how much material we present at one time. This also relates to home, where you might say, like, I told my kids about 3 things to do, and we get like one of them, and then we kind of lose the rest. That's a sort of a sign of this overload, like too many things at once to necessarily navigate. So we wanted to study this a bit more with the aim of how can we educate families and teachers, and how can we help support them on setting up the system so that these kids can be successful, because they're all capable. But the pathway to that sort of success is often quite bumpy, right? And if we don't have it set up well, then sometimes we don't reach their capabilities. And if we do, then there's a lot more potential that we can reach our capabilities. So we know that just as a base, many of our children with NF1 have difficulty with cognitive load, and that's related to working memory challenges. Again, that short-term kind of active process of, I always say in parents, it's like going to the store with your mental shopping list. Sometimes that goes well, sometimes not so much. You get home and realize you've forgotten a few things. Thinking as a mental notepad, you're keeping information in your mind while you're doing something. That's what working memory is. Now, that information can get moved into long-term memory, but it doesn't always need to. So that process is often for kids with NF1 challenging. And I would say their mental notepad has less capacity, right? So once we hit that capacity, now things are just kind of overflowing, and it's just becomes very overwhelming. This can interfere, again, socially, academically, at home. But what we know is that if we can target working memory, we have some potential for impacting the overload issue. Okay. All right, so that's our overload. So we're not at the point where, so what that's driven us to is we really understand that kids with NF1, they get less accurate, they get, when we increase the load of what we're asking them to do. That's leading us now to working memory interventions. So we're in the process now of starting to do not only studies, but also clinical services where we can target working memory and help kids kind of build that up. And that is really amenable to interventions. Our sleep study that we call green, sleep and learning. So this is not a sleep study where you're getting hooked up to stuff and spending the night. When we first put this out there, there was a sleep study. I was like, no, we're not doing that. But we had 2 parts to this study. So there were 2 main aims. One, this is actually, like Dr. Siegel was saying, that the CTF registry has thousands and thousands of individuals and families registered to it. And it's really actually a place where we can, expand past the DC area and learn more and kind of more generalized information about what's going on in the NF community. So the first thing we did in this study is sent a survey through that registry to adults with NF1, parents of children with NF1, and then we also had an adolescent-specific questionnaire so that teens could report themselves on their sleep, because we all know that most of us with teens don't have any idea what's going on after we fall asleep, which is much earlier than they do. So we really wanted to hear it from the teens. So that's the first phase, and that phase is done. So I'm going to share what we learned there, and we're going to publish that. The second phase is still ongoing. So I'll say if anybody's interested, we're happy to have you. And what the second phase is that we're bringing kids from children's in. We're doing a battery of neurocognitive tests as well as this sleep survey to learn about if your child has trouble with sleep. We're going to then also look at what's the relationship to their cognitive function, how they're doing in school, et cetera, and understand what the relationship is there. We know from other populations that sleep, and from anybody in general, sleep's super important, right? If you're fatigued, you're not focused, you can be irritable, et cetera. So we're trying to understand what's unique about NF1 related to that, and then how can we target that. So this is from the broad survey that went, and this was actually international. We had folks from Europe and other countries respond to this. We had, initially we had like 600 surveys that came in, so it's a really nice broad representation. We looked at two aspects of sleep: disturbance, which is what I'm going to show you here, which are things like trouble falling asleep or insomnia, nightmares, et cetera. And then the next slide is sleep impairment, and that's how sleep disruption impairs your day-to-day life. Okay, so those are the two main aspects. So when it comes to rates of sleep disturbance, we had 50% of the respondents of this survey say that they or their children, if they're an adult with NF1 or their child has NF1, 50% almost have problems falling asleep, getting to sleep at night. And you'll see this sort of going to bed time seems to be the big hitter for our NF1 kids. Like staying asleep, less of a problem, morning stuff, less of a problem, not nothing, but it's really the getting to bed part. Sleep maintenance, meaning like how long, like staying asleep through the night, is the second on here, and nightmares at about 20%. We didn't see a lot of reporting of sleep apnea, narcolepsy, which is just a disorder where you can fall asleep anytime, restless legs, which was interesting because I feel like I've heard clinically more families saying their kids are very restless during the night. But these were less reported in the survey. And then sleep impairment, okay, I think you guys can see this okay. So I broke this up into the teenagers, which are the red bars, their self-report, and then the parents. This doesn't include our adults with NF in this slide. But you can see that, for the teens, they're talking about like, I'm kind of falling asleep in the day off and on every once in a while, so I might be in class kind of like nodding off. That was a really big one. You can see at the end, at the bottom there, like 80%, almost 80% of the kids are saying that's a struggle every day. Kids with NF1. And then next is like feeling moody or being in a bad mood because they're tired, right? Productivity is kind of up there, like feeling like they're less productive because of fatigue and being tired in the day. And then for parents, it was a little bit different. It had actually more to do with emotional regulation, mood related to their kids not getting good sleep or being tired, right? So you see, again, more of that emotional and behavioral output of that, which is, again, hard for people to figure out, because when we have kids in the office and we're concerned about behavior, there can be a lot of reasons for that, right? So we want to make sure we understand what are the different things we should be asking about, and sleep seems like that's certainly one of them. We want to know how sleep is going. So this is really insightful. So when we asked about this, we had about sleep-related disorders and other information about it. We had people report that 14% of the kids had met with a sleep specialist at some point, so significant enough sleep trouble where they've sought out a specialist. About 33% take melatonin to support sleep initiation and getting to bed at night. That's not necessarily a bad thing, although we at the meeting, we'll see where this takes us, because at our scientific meeting, there was actually a good discussion about this and whether that is a great strategy for these kids. I think we've got to learn a lot more about that. And 4% taking some other kind of medication for sleep. Here's the big hitter, and you all know this already. So I'll just reiterate, get the devices away at least a half an hour before bed. So really a good significant number of our kids and the parents of our kids were saying they're watching TV or using the device like in that half hour before going to sleep. That's a problem, right? We know, because the blue light disrupts sleep and getting to sleep. So this is common in, I think, every kid in the world, but it may have a bigger impact on our kids with NF1 who already may be predisposed to having difficulty sleeping, right? So again, the same old rules, don't have TVs in kids or anybody's room, really try to set up a system so it's a half hour before we're breaking off from that. We're going to get settled down for sleep, but that definitely can make it worse for that getting to bedtime. Not too much caffeine intake or things like that, thankfully, so it doesn't seem to be a major problem for our kiddos at this point. Now, here's the next caveat to this. Our kids with NF1 and ADHD are the ones with the biggest problems. This isn't probably not breaking news, but it is a little chicken and egg, right? Because if we have kids who have ADHD symptoms, we want to know about their sleep, because certainly if they have significant sleep disruptions, that can mimic things like ADHD, right? Just like it does in any of us. If we're extremely tired, again, we're not focused, we're not able to be as productive and engage in our work in the same way. So what we're looking at here, though, are kids who had already been diagnosed or suspected to have ADHD, and then how many of them had sleep problems. So you can see that certainly more of our kids, it was really 62% of our kids with ADHD had reported sleep problems. Those with NF1 and no ADHD, that was only in about 29%. So there's definitely some relationship, it seems like here. So again, if you have a child with NF1 and ADHD, this is a potentially bigger challenge and something for us, again, to try to figure out. This did not have anything to do with whether they were male, female, or if they had anxiety or depression. We wanted to look at that as well, because obviously depression can disrupt sleep, et cetera, but that did not show us any relationship in this study. So we know that sleep seems to be problematic in terms of that going to bedtime. The adolescents report actually more sleep problems. I don't know if that's too different than the general population. We'd need a control group to speak to that, but we certainly know adolescents don't sleep well. They stay up too late. They want, sleep really late. That's normal. So I don't know. I can't really speak to whether this is significantly different than our general adolescent population at this point. Going to sleep, media use before bed, but the other things we saw that were reported, sleep avoidance, problems sleeping alone, probably for a lot of the younger children, but even into an age where maybe you think, my kiddo should be able to go and sleep on their own now. Restlessness and inconsistent sleep, and still, even in the morning, fatigue. Okay, so we talked about those other things. So that's that study. I know this is like rapid fire, but I hope I can give you at least the highlights, and then when we get to lunch, we can talk in more detail about anything you want. So this is a newer study that we just finished up, our Unstuck and On Target Executive Function Intervention study. This was a pilot to see about feasibility and how acceptable this intervention was to our NF1 families. This is an intervention that was developed in our autism team with Dr. Lauren Kenworthy, and it was specifically developed initially for kids with autism. But we are now branching out to realize that this intervention, which focuses on aspects of executive function like flexibility, emotional control, working memory, that these, and organization, that these things are relevant to many more children than just those that have autism. So we decided, we know that some of our kids with NF1 struggle socially. We know executive functions are a challenge. This perhaps could be a really good way to kind of provide an intervention. So we did this pilot study. It was a 20-week group intervention. I did highlight here, and I'm happy to send out, that there is an online parent version of this where you can kind of get the strategies and the ideas around this program that you can implement at home. And this really takes you through it. It's free, and if it's not, write me, because I think there was definitely a code for getting this for free. So that can help kind of get things started if there's not a group available at any particular time. So when we did this, so the way that it's set up, the kids came every week, and we had a 1-hour group session where we had, it's really a set plan for what we're working on each week around these executive functions and socialization. And then for part of that group, the last 15 minutes, I would go out and meet with the parents there. And then we'd talk about what we had done in the group, how to try to implement that at home, ways to practice the strategies outside. And then they were gone and they came back. I will say this group, it was really a lot of fun, and I'll get to sort of some of the summaries of things. But the parents, most of them felt that there was some change that was noticeable to them in that 20 weeks in their child's behavior, attitude, or emotions following their participation. They all said they thought their child became more flexible and had better planning skills after this. And again, it's very specific. We teach kids language to use and strategies, specific strategies to use about when they're getting stuck on something, how to organize, how to identify emotions, and which then helps them regulate, right? So this is, we weren't really in it for like how well it worked yet. We just wanted to see if we can do it, and if parents are like, this is cool, we'll show up, right? But then we did get them to tell us, based on a 5-point scale, you can see their ratings on how helpful the different elements of the program were. The big hard part, which is great because it's got us thinking now how we can do, what can we do differently, is taking these skills and applying them in daily life, which is true always, right? If you're working with a psychotherapist, it's taking those and applying them to the rest of your life. In our organized group setting, it's much easier because we can guide them in the moment. And what I found is that the challenges around flexibility that parents were telling me about each of their children didn't always necessarily, we couldn't get them to go into those in the group setting. So that was one thing. We didn't get to practice the hardest stuff sometimes in our setting. And then that was reliant on parents in those hot moments where it's like, this has always been a challenge and we can't figure out how to get out of it. Trying to apply these things and having the kids go along with it was the hardest part for them. And so that makes sense to me, and it's definitely a place where we can think about how we can support parents even more. So that was that. It was feasible. I mean, the kids actually were sad if they had to miss one, and I think we only had 2 times a child missed, and one he didn't miss, he was sick, and he zoomed into the group because they just made such a nice connection with each other. He was a little not present because the dogs were all in there and stuff, but he came. It was good. And all the children in the group had never met another child with NF1, and so that was another just, I thought, remarkable part of this. I'm always shocked by how many kids have never met somebody else that has NF1, and it can be such an important part of their development and growth and quality of life. So that was amazing. And the moms it was all moms that had come with the group. They also established, in some sense, had their own little group in the waiting room, right, while we were in group, because they shared resources with each other. So there was more to it than just the structured intervention that I thought was very, very positive. And we talked about the others. Okay, I'm probably past my time. Oh, I'm not. Yes. So these are some upcoming studies, and I totally forgot about the Gone to Seen study. I don't know how, probably because I feel like it's down the road slightly a bit still. But there's some ongoing and upcoming studies. I'm happy to talk to you about them if you want to know more, if you want to participate, whatever, it's all great. So our sleep and learning study, the dream study, is still ongoing. We need about 10 more participants, so we're trying to wrap that up this year so we can publish that information and share it with you all. We are in development for another executive function intervention. This is going to be initially for our kids that have some kind of tumor. So it won't be completely open to all of NF right now. We need to sort of start in one space, but if there's a child with NF1 that does have some kind of tumor, they will be eligible for that. That's a program called C-Ready. And I think I like this even better than the Unstuck because it's very individualized. Each person brings their own target challenge, and the same things are applied to it, but everybody's kind of focus is unique. So I think that's going to be helpful, and it has a lot more parent engagement through the process of the intervention, and I think that will target that issue we're hearing from parents of like, it's really hard to take what you taught us and do it at home, which I absolutely get. So that will be upcoming. We're writing the IRB protocol now, so we'll definitely keep you informed when that starts up. And then this study, I got to tell you about here because it's going to be hard for people to understand why this is an important one because it's going to sound weird. But one of the things we've worked on in the NF community is the challenge we have, so how this has typically gone in the past is that we have mice with NF1, right? And we learn a lot of things about them and we try a bunch of stuff out there, whether it's for tumor, treatments or it's for cognition. And then the hope and the plan is to translate what we learn there into the human beings in this room and beyond. At least, especially in the cognitive area, that's never been successful. And I think so we've really focused on why is that and how can we make that better. And there's a lot of really important work going on, and when you asked me the question at lunchtime, I'll say more about this, about are these mouse models the right ones, but even more, how can we align this better? So there's a lot more going on with conversations in both directions. In the past, it's been more driven by, we know this about these NFL mice, let's see if it works in let's take it to humans, which is what all medicine's really about. But now we're talking in the other direction to say, here's what we see in our kids, here's where the problems are, how can we mimic that in a mouse model to learn something, it's a bi-directional conversation. We have a study that will be coming up that I'll be really trying to ask the folks at Children's to support, which is we now have tools to assess things like different aspects of learning and cognition in mice and humans that should align better. So what I'm saying is we have a mouse test where the mouse goes and has to pay attention, right, and make selections based on certain stimuli. We actually have that same kind of test for people. And so there's 4 different tests that there are equivalents of that a guy that actually has done a lot of work outside of NF1, his name's Jared Young, he's remarkable. He's done this work for a long time. So he's engaged with the NF community now and saying, we can do better than this. We don't even have the same measurements in the past, right? We're saying, well, like we see this in a mouse when we throw them into a pool of water and they try to learn where the little platform is and they're bad at that. They're like, okay, I don't really throw kids into water and see what's happening there. And also, it's a different kind of learning, and it's, to me, has never really represented what we're talking about in the kids. So this is the wrong story for saying, I'm going to be asking kids to come in and do these tasks. They're nothing physical. They're all sort of the things I do, like, clicking things in response to, paying attention to a certain stimuli, et cetera. So that we can really learn, do these tests that we're talking about now, do they capture the problems that we're seeing? So that's important, because if they don't, then they're not useful to us, right? And then hopefully they do capture that, and then do they also capture that in the NF mouse? Because then if we have that going on, now when they try some kind of new intervention or drug in the mouse and it works, then we go, we can really take that, over the process to our families and patients, and we have this equivalent outcome to say, okay, that actually worked with the kids or it didn't. So just the not short story about all the challenges that come with translating things within the NF1 scientific world. But these are all important aspects. So it's a weird study, not weird like the experience will be weird, but I'm sure most people will be like, what? I don't understand what you're doing. So I'll talk to you more about that, but that is upcoming. And then finally, and then I'm going to get off the stage and let somebody else talk, there is a new study coming up through the NF Clinical Trials Consortium, which we are part of, that will be enrolling children with NF1 and ADHD to look at a drug called guanfacine. It's a non-stimulant drug for treating ADHD a little bit differently. It tends to, we're interested in it because it seems to do better in kids that have autism, and again, we know that some of our kids have autism as well. And so that will be coming up, I don't know when we'll start, but it's still in process, probably in about a year from now, truthfully. But we'll keep you updated on that. Kids will be able to be in it if they're already on a stimulant to see if there's an added benefit of guanfacine. So we'll definitely share more about that study with you guys and see if there's something that might be helpful to you. Okay, and I can't end without thanking all the families and the kids who have made all the things I've just shared with you possible, because without them, I've got nothing to say. And it's a lot of effort. I know we're always asking you all about, hey, we've got another study, and we do really try to be thoughtful because there's so much, but I think that comes from the drive that we all have of wanting to make progress and do more. And I think we just have to go like, okay, wait, we can't ask people to be in like 10 studies at a time. It's a lot. So we are thinking about that, but it really is our passion to kind of drive things forward and learn and make life better. So hopefully hopefully you'll understand that. But you can say no. And then this is the growing team for NF and brain tumor programs. Dr. Tina Thomas and Dr. Caitlin Kapp, who was a fellow with me and just is staying on, have joined the team, so you'll probably get to know them more. Dr. Joy has been around longer than me, and he's doing some work with us. And then if you've been in research, you've probably heard from either Rebecca or Meredith, who are my awesome research coordinators, young people that know how to do technology stuff. You know, you need somebody like that in your space. But that's it. And I thank you guys. I hope this was helpful in terms of hearing what we've been working on and what contribution you all have made to what we're trying to do here. So glad you're here. Thank you so much.
Hi. So Dr. Walsh really gave a great lead into my talk, and I think it's going to build on some of the things that she talked about. And really teed up a lot of these discussions about ADHD and neurofibromatosis. I think one thing that we're going to cover is talking about the rates of ADHD and neurofibromatosis type 1 to what we see in the general population. And one thing that I think is important to talk about is that a lot of what we know about ADHD, or a lot of the way that we treat ADHD is kind of extrapolated from what's done in the general population. We don't really have a lot of good research, which Dr. Walsh talked about, on treatments that are specific for ADHD in neurofibromatosis. We want to talk a little bit, and again, this is an area that we're trying to understand more about, getting back to mice models, is the potential reasons for why ADHD occurs at a higher rate in neurofibromatosis. So understanding a little bit about basic biology, how we can translate some of that into, again, thinking about better ways to support individuals with ADHD and NF. And then review a little bit about ADHD symptoms and diagnosis, but really talk also about treatment options for ADHD and NF. And I think one key point that I wanted to make is that I'm a neurodevelopmental pediatrician by background, so it's been really a great collaboration with Dr. Siegel in terms of managing the NF clinic and the program, and we come at the patients that we're taking care of from different perspectives and different backgrounds, but I always look at things from a developmental perspective. So ADHD symptoms, behaviors look very different depending on how old a child is, where they are developmentally. We look at it differently in preschool age children than we do for elementary school age children than we do for middle schoolers and high schoolers, and then adults. There's a whole growing category of individuals who are working on ADHD management as well. In the general population, we tend to see the current rates are about 11% of children. So you look at any, again, thinking about a classroom environment, about 1 out of every 10 children is going to have a diagnosis of ADHD, even if they're not overtly showing any of those symptoms or behaviors. In NF type 1, the prevalence numbers have been kind of all over the place, and they've been up to about 60% of individuals meeting diagnostic criteria. So it's one of these things that I think, as I'm seeing children in clinic or individuals in clinic, again, because of my background and my perspective, we're asking about some of those symptoms. We're sort of looking for parents to offer concerns about some of these issues, and more so than we would in sort of a general pediatric clinic probably, because we just know the rates are higher in this condition. Tend to see more of the inattentive type or the combined type, which is inattentive and hyperactive. I'm sure as parents, and this is something that we see in classrooms as well, is the hyperactive, sort of impulsive kids tend to draw the spotlight and tend to come up to clinical attention more than the inattentive, kind of dreamy, spacey kinds of kids too. But again, as a parent, we're sort of teed into seeing some of these things and looking for those in the kids that we're raising and taking care of. I'd also say too that when we think about ADHD, again, we can talk about behaviors, and we have a lot of folks who say, I'm a little bit ADHD, or I'm feeling kind of inattentive, or, I kind of get a little bit impulsive sometimes. I'm driving in traffic, and somebody cuts me off, and I kind of get, a little irritated at that. When we think about ADHD as a diagnosis, we're really looking at a level of what we use the term impairment. So it's actually having an effect on daily function. How successful is somebody getting through the day? How well are they able to get through the school day and get the work done successfully? As an adult, how well are they able to get through work and manage all the responsibilities of daily life? Or are they, talking Dr. Walsh's point about cognitive overload, how much are they getting kind of overwhelmed by everything they've got to manage? outside of school, how well are kids able to manage social relationships, family expectations, chores, getting things done at home as well. So all of those things play into the difference between saying I've got some symptoms of ADHD versus I'm meeting criteria for a diagnosis. And it moves from that point of the concept of executive function, which Dr. Walsh talked a lot about, to thinking about us getting to a medical diagnosis of ADHD as a condition and something that warrants intervention or treatment. So why does ADHD happen in EMF? We've got some theories. Dopamine and norepinephrine systems are at play in animal models, and the drugs that we use to treat ADHD tend to target those neurotransmitter symptoms. So we think about how well the dopamine system is working. It's this kind of reward system we have in our brains that's sort of providing feedback in terms of what's good, what we like, how we pursue certain things of interest. So that idea of, we talk a lot about this with ADHD, is that kids are really good and can really lock into the things that they're interested in, so the things that they like. They're really into drawing, they're really into, their favorite video games, and they can do those all day long, but give them a non-preferred activity, and they really have a tough time sticking with something that just doesn't catch their interest. So it's this dopamine reward system that tends to be at play there. And then the norepinephrine systems, those tend to be your fight or flight kind of response. I tend to think about that more in the reactivity or the kind of fight or flight kind of response, the impulsivity. I don't like this, and I'm going to sort of just have an automatic reaction to it instead of taking a breath, counting to 5 and sort of taking a little bit of time to reflect. Again, as adults, you get that email and you're irritated and you're ready to fire off the email response. Maybe, take a breath, walk around, in the hallway and then get back and think about whether or not that's really a good idea or a bad idea to send off that email in response. And then we think about, especially with neurofibromatosis, I think thinking about this concept of neural network systems, and not just thinking about neurotransmitters and synapses, but how these brain networks are operating and whether or not the changes that we see genetically, molecularly with NF are actually having an effect on some of these networks as well. And that's a lot of work that gets into neuroimaging, functional imaging, understanding a little bit about studies that we didn't really talk about yet, but having individuals go into a scanner and have them do certain tasks and see what those brain networks look like in those scanners. So again, we're trying to understand some of the ways that these systems work on attention systems, on our ability to internally reflect on what we're doing at the time, making judgments about how we're directing our attention and our activity, and then being able to plan ahead as well. So getting into these executive function aspects and behaviors. And so symptoms and features, again, we think about what you need from a medical diagnosis to get to the point where you meet criteria for ADHD. There are 9 symptoms that go into the inattentive bucket, and then 9 symptoms that go into the impulsive and hyperactive buckets. And technically, to have an ADHD diagnosis, you end up checking off 6 out of 9 of each of those sets of symptoms. So 6 out of 9 inattentive symptoms, 6 out of 9 or more of the hyperactive impulsive symptoms. We think about, again, this idea of sustained attention. How well are you able to keep on track with a particular activity, or do you get, 2 minutes into a set of math problems, are you bored and you're getting up and sort of, roaming around looking for a snack? Distractibility, I always think about the movie Up and the dog in Up, getting distracted by the squirrel. Impulsivity, so again, this idea of just, I've got something in mind and I'm going to just jump on that and follow that thread without sort of pausing and taking a breath. And then the hyperactivity, I've seen somebody recently who just said, when my 5-year-old is watching TV, they're just in constant motion, and, they're just like, there's nonstop movement all day long. And you wonder, I always think about, how many calories we're burning when we're doing that. And then how some kids end up being on the leaner side just from probably burning all those calories all day long from constant movement. And so again, this idea of executive function, which Dr. Walsh talked about, response inhibition. So again, the check yourself before you wreck yourself kind of approach to managing what's happening around you. Vigilance, the idea of actually monitoring what's happening around you to attend to relevant stimuli and ignore what we would call non-relevant stimuli. Subshifting, so being able to sort of shift from one set of activities to the next at appropriate times and not sort of bounce from one thing to the next. planning and organization, and this idea of being able to structure your day. These are the things I'm going to do during the day. Organization, this is how I'm going to actually set up some goals and make progress towards those goals. You get a lot of kids, I tend to think, are saying, Twitch at some point, but the kids who are, YouTube, kids who decide they're going to just wake up the next morning and become like the next big influencer on YouTube or on Twitch or TikTok, and not realizing that there are steps you have to do. You can't just start posting videos and expect you're going to get, a million followers. That people put a lot of work into that, and there's a whole planning and organizing process to that as well. And so the diagnosis, we do want to see, or we don't want to see, but we look for symptoms to happen in different environments. We have a lot of families, and I remember a family that I'd seen where the questionnaires came back positive for ADHD symptoms at school, but not at home. And so then we have a discussion about, how are we going to navigate this and decide whether or not a child has a diagnosis. So you expect to see the symptoms happening both at school and at home. Again, this idea of impairment or how much it's interfering with a child's ability to get through the day or family function, a family with a younger child who may have a tough time getting out of the house because their child is so impulsive and so hyperactive, so reactive that they have a tough time getting to the store to do chores and things like that. We take into account history, try to do what we can with a child interview, again, at different ages and developmental stages, seeing how much, we can get information from the child themselves, behavioral observations. I always put the caveat that when I'm seeing children in our clinic, you've come into the hospital, you've waited in the waiting room, you've gone through your vital signs, you're in an exam room that, isn't probably the most exciting environment other than all the medical equipment that the kids can play with. So I'm not expecting sort of typical behavior when I'm seeing kids in an office setting, so I tend to take that into account. But I also do look at sort of how they're engaging and how they're doing when they're going through the interview process as well. The rating scales and then neuropsychological evaluation as well. And that's really critical, I think, from the standpoint of a lot of the kids that we do see in the ENF program, where it's not just whatever this concept is of simple ADHD, that there can be some complicating factors, anxiety, autism spectrum disorder, developmental delay, or intellectual disability. Thinking about the other medical issues, I'll touch very briefly on sleep as a factor as well, but thinking about how all of that goes into that profile and trying to tease out how much can we say is strictly ADHD or how much is this mix of a couple of different things going on that's causing some of those symptoms to come out. And so there are a number of associated conditions we see, and if your child goes through a neuropsychological evaluation, you might see some of these coming up in terms of these co-occurring conditions that we talked about. Learning disorders are definitely, again, something that we're on the lookout for in terms of the kids that we're seeing in our clinic, is identifying when there are some of these concerns that come up in terms of learning and how well we can separate out ADHD symptoms and progress with academics and learning from a true learning disorder. Developmental coordination disorder, we have a lot of children who are kind of clumsy and have a tough time with eye-hand coordination, and some of that comes from sort of general processing. Again, I can think about this as sort of attentional issues and executive function, is how are we organizing ourselves in terms of moving through space and our bodies and how we're reacting to the environment. Anxiety, autism, global developmental delay, intellectual disability, we can definitely see as part of that profile as well. And then tics can come up, and those can be a complication for us in terms of the ways that we're thinking about different medications to treat ADHD symptoms as well. And so getting into this idea of treatments, I always talk with families about a triad of approaches. It's very easy for me as a medical provider to just say you've got ADHD, here's your prescription for a medication to treat it. We're going to really think about this more holistically and globally and make sure we're covering educational support. I think any child who gets to the point where we have an ADHD diagnosis needs to have at least a 504 plan, classroom accommodations that are in place in school to help them with learning. Make sure that we are looking again for things like a learning disability or any kind of cognitive challenges that might be affecting a child's ability to learn, anything that would warrant getting to that point where we have an individualized education program in place and that additional level of special education support in school. Child behavior therapy, I think this is a aspirational, unfortunately, these days in terms of access to mental health, but I think every child or individual who has ADHD should be working on some of these skills, not just relying on medications to treat the condition and the symptoms, but really thinking about how we're working on some of these strategies. So, and when I think about child behavior therapy, we tend to think about parent-directed for younger children. So this idea, you can end up with different terminology for this: parent-directed, parent coaching, parent training. I've gotten bounce back from people about these concepts of training parents or coaching parents. So I don't think that is really just from a parent standpoint, what are the strategies you can use to help your child? Again, work on those attentive skills, work on the impulsivity and the hyperactivity to help, again, help them get through the day more successfully. And oftentimes from that standpoint, help families home function end up being smoother as well. And then for older children, cognitive behavioral therapy approaches to help them sort of develop that insight, that self-awareness, that ability to monitor and recognize how to manage those symptoms themselves as well. We do end up with more intensive behavioral interventions for some individuals, and this falls into the umbrella of applied behavior analysis or ABA therapy, if you've heard about this. And those tend to be more significant needs, especially safety concerns, kids who are eloping, where there's a risk of danger to themselves or others in terms of physical issues or injury as well. And I think I didn't put this on here, but the things like the unstuck and on target, and I'm a huge, folks who know me, I'm a big cheerleader for the executive function interventions that have been developed. I'm biased because I know the people who develop these interventions, but I think that they're fantastic. And have gone through the online programming myself to sort of understand again sort of how to use those skills with my own kids and how I can talk to families in clinic about those strategies and how helpful they can be. And then the last category is the medication issue. And so we tend to think about stimulant medications as being the longest studied, and really when you look at studies across the board, the most effective form of medication treatment for ADHD. So with this concept of ADHD without anything co-occurring, when you have children who have simple ADHD and no other medical issues, you can get up to about a 90% positive effect rate on ADHD symptoms with stimulant medications. And methylphenidate, which the brand name is Ritalin, and some associated compounds and formulations, is sort of the prototype. A lot of folks know about Adderall and amphetamine-based stimulant medications as well. And all of these come with different short-acting, long-acting pills that you swallow, sprinkles that you can open up and take with applesauce or yogurt. There's a patch formulation of methylphenidate. There are ones now that you can take the night before that have a delayed release formulation as well. So the pharmaceutical companies, to their benefit, are trying to figure out all these different ways that they can formulate these medications that are going to be as easy as it can be for individuals to take these medications. And from a parent standpoint, they're trying to make that medication administration as smooth as possible as well. And then, as I said, we see a high rate of effectiveness for ADHD symptoms in patients without co-occurring conditions. I do a lot of work outside of the NF clinic, but also now with the NF clinic on seeing children with autism and ADHD, for example. And the rates tend to be lower of effectiveness in individuals with that particular profile. Side effects also tend to be a little bit higher with folks like that as well. So we just have those discussions about goals of treatment and making sure that we're tracking the positive effect of the medication with monitoring those side effects and making sure that there's a good balance there, that the side effects are not outweighing any kind of positive effect that we get from medication. So the side effects do tend to include decreased appetite, and this is pretty much something that I talk to a lot of families about. We do get a lot of kids who are on the weaner side, and we're watching the growth curves, and we want to make sure that we are having them set up to be able to grow to their full potential from a physical growth standpoint as well, that we're not doing anything like, I never want to be prescribing a medication that's going to be limiting a child's ultimate potential growth, the weight issues we definitely want to monitor. And again, it's a matter of watching to make sure that we are adequately treating the ADHD symptoms, but also, again, not causing too much of an effect in terms of appetite, caloric intake, and weight gain and growth. Stomach aches and headaches can be an issue. And then for a lot of kids, and this, again, we tend to see this more with individuals with autism or with anxiety that tends to be co-occurring with ADHD, is that anxiety can really bubble up and become a much more significant problem. With a stimulant, irritability can come up as well. Kids who are just have tantrums or get frustrated more easily, who might have end up being more tearful or just sort of like meltdowns when they wouldn't ordinarily have meltdowns. My rule of thumb with stimulants and pretty much anything that I'm prescribing medication-wise for ADHD is if you don't like the way your child is on a medication, we stop it, we brainstorm, we might try a different stimulant, we might then go to a non-stimulant, but I don't want to be in a place where your child is worse with the medication we're prescribing than they were before we were talking about medication. So we want to make sure we're finding, again, that balance between the positive effect of the medication for ADHD and any kind of negative side effects. And a lot of the side effects we can manage with ongoing monitoring and discussion. That the appetite issues might be there, but we're working on making sure that we're identifying healthy, high-calorie foods that are going to get in, that are going to help with weight gain. Stomach aches and headaches are these things that we can manage and help a child through the day. The same thing for anxiety and irritability, other ways that we can think about how to help a child when they're starting to get a little bit more anxious, that can help them sort of come down into a more typical emotional regulation zone, things like that we can sort of talk through along the way. And again, we've got these different extended release, short-acting formulations, pills, sprinkle capsules, liquids, patches, delayed relief. So all these different wonderful ways that the pharmaceutical companies are coming up with new ways to package medications, which you can look at it on a cynical level, but I also look at it on a positive level, that there are all these options, and it's not just here's a pill that you need to swallow, depending on how old you are and where you are in terms of taking medication. And then the non-stimulants, Dr. Walsh had talked about the guanfacine study. These are technically coded as alpha-adrenergic agonists. So these are working on this norepinephrine system primarily in our brains. The kind of short-acting or as extended release formulations. The extended release formulations are branded as Intuniv and Captay. The side effects for these can be sedation. So these started out on the market as blood pressure medications, so we can get lowering the blood pressure and some sleepiness or sedating side effects. Coming with that also is some dizziness and lightheadedness. We can get constipation, headache. We've had what one psychiatrist described as sort of the grumpy kid syndrome when it comes to how some kids will respond to these medications as well. And so, again, with these, they can work very well for a lot of kids who either don't tolerate stimulant medications or kids who need a little bit more help with managing that impulsivity and that reactivity, because they're working on these epinephrine systems, these fight-or-flight systems in our brain. I tend to think about that as helping bring the edge down on that a little bit as well. And we have this discussion about side effects. The right dosing, sometimes I'll go up a little bit on the dose and we'll end up with some of the sedation or sleepiness or lightheadedness, and so we'll back down again and we'll try to find that right fit dosing as far as medication is concerned. The other two non-stimulant medications are atomoxetine is the generic, Strattera is the brand, and viloxazine or Qelbree is the other new non-stimulant that's been put on the market that work as selective norepinephrine reuptake inhibitors. So again, working on this particular system or neurotransmitter process in terms of how we think about the physiology of ADHD. Side effects are pretty similar to what we've already talked about: sedation, dizziness, nausea, decreased appetite, constipation, headache, irritability. Again, starting these medications sometimes as a second or third line if we've tried and haven't really seen a lot of good success with stimulant medications. And so we want to make sure, again, we're finding that balance of a positive effect of the medication with the side effects of medication as well. And then lifestyle factors, going back again to Dr. Walsh's talk about sleep, that's something that I've really keyed in on a lot more in the last year or two, is really talking about good quality sleep in terms of hygiene, schedule, and routine. So we're doing as much as we can to help with that bedtime routine and sleep initiation going smoothly. A good night of sleep, as Dr. Walsh said, I think we all know how differently we feel when we're sleep deprived versus when we're getting a good, full night of sleep. There's a great book, I'm blanking on the author's name, but Why We Sleep is the name of the book. Matthew, I want to say Walsh, but I could be wrong about that as well. No relation. But yeah, it's a great book that covers all these issues about sleep and talks about some of these things that we wrestle with in terms of devices and all the ways that we keep our brain stimulated right before bedtime, which are not great from a sleep standpoint. And then diet is, again, a factor. And I get a lot of questions about additives and preservatives and things like that, and I think there just hasn't been enough research specifically on those issues, but I think we sort of know as a society what those healthy options are and what happens when we're getting that sort of, probably if we had people who were had glucose monitors on, we would see these like sort of spikes and drops in terms of their glucose levels and what that can do to us in terms of mood and attention and our ability to regulate our behavior as well. And that's speaking sort of more generally. And then physical activity, I think, as I talked about, we moved from this aspect of being preschoolers and elementary school kids where you can just run around and play all day and go to the playground to being, we see this more with elementary school kids now, but the more the preference is to be on, playing video games and watching streaming shows, and there's much less physical activity except if it's within the context of an organized activity. So thinking about ways that we can keep kids moving, or even sometimes just say like, get on, if you have a treadmill at home or a stationary bike, still keep the videos up and you can watch your shows, but just be moving during the time, 30 minutes on the treadmill, 30 minutes on the stationary bike, you can watch, the latest Marvel streaming show while you're doing that. As long as you're moving, that's fine. A walk around the block, with your family is wonderful. Getting into the habit of taking your pet out for a walk is great too. So any of those things also do the job, but just really encouraging movement on a regular basis is really fundamental from my standpoint of, again, thinking about it probably as another leg of our treatment approaches to ADHD.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for being here. It's so great to recognize some of my family's faces. My name is Niranjan. I'm one of the rehab doctor here. I'm the rehab specialist in part of the NS clinic. And we talked about this topic last year, but I added a new topic on fatigue because I knew we had some questions about that. So hopefully that'll be helpful. But today I'll be focusing on common pain that I participate in intervening for our families and patients here, and really talking about the etiology, some of the things that we can do to consider for treatment, and some of the musculoskeletal things, and fatigue, and how we approach as a PM&R provider on addressing these issues. I just wanted to highlight how we assess our patients and a human being. This is the International Classification Function Disability Health Model, and you can see you can have a health condition. You can have a health condition that can impact your activities, and depending on what impairment you may have, and then how that could impact the participation and all these environmental personal factors that can impact health. And a child with MS can still be healthy, but maybe the child has falciform and his left leg, that's hard, that impacts difficulty with jumping and running, and that leads to decrease in participation. And maybe, we recommend physical therapy, but getting access to therapy for multiple other reasons environmentally can be difficult. And maybe he's too young and he's not motivated to pursue physical therapy. And all these things can take part in how we define health and how we define we are living a good quality of life. So, the pain in NF population is one of the topics that's been studied for a really long time, and unfortunately, the prevalence of having pain is pretty high, at least 50 to 65. With NE plus neurofibromatosis, there's highest correlation having the neurofibromatosis and maybe 90% with pain at least one time during the time. And some of the studies, especially in longer-term follow-up, saying average pain lasting more than 10 years, which, really for sure defines the chronic pain that some of my patients can have. And it could be multiple body parts. There are some studies that, there's more prevalence in the arm or, et cetera. But the burden of pain is pretty significant. And what's important to know is just because you have class 4 in your fibroma doesn't mean that you are going to have pain. It depends on the size. It depends on the location. When you are in a sensitive location, or layman tends to have a little bit more symptoms. If you have a bigger neurofibroma, it can be more symptomatic. And the character of tumor seems to also impact whether you're going to have pain or not. And unfortunately, again, the incidence of having pain is pretty high, and the severity is at least moderate is more common assessment that's been done and, impacting multiple things. And, having up to 90% or even 65, 70% of having pain is much more than typical kids without any health conditions. And there is some sort of reason why our patients with NF have increased pain. And there's been several studies indicating with, NF lung impacting the fibromin and things like that can change the pain pathway, which I'll discuss about in the next slide. And we talked about how these plexiform can cause and has a high correlation with having pain, and that itself can cause, compression of the nerve roots, causing maybe a nerve pain. You can have decreased range of motion from having restriction from the tumor burden, and you can have secondary skeletal pain. And also, these asymmetries can all be part of the reason why you can have increased pain. Just going into a little bit in depth about the pain science is that the neuronal hyperexcitability with reduced neurofibromin that's produced from the impairment of NF1 is the basic concept. The majority of the assessment on why we have increased pain. And the idea is, the pain pathway is supposed to protect us, right? Like if you hit something that's really hot or really sharp, you're supposed to respond and have the pain so that you're not able to do that. And that sensor feedback is supposed to be just at the right amount where it's not, it's uncomfortable for you to stop that action, but it's not causing a longer lasting pain unless, as soon as you take the insult out. But what's happened here with NF is that the pathway is hyperexcitable, so small things can cause more pain, and you can have increased pain perception through the pathway of the pain perception. So whenever we hear about any of our patients indicating that there may be something discomforting or any pain, we take it very seriously and we try to figure out where is that coming from, and we will act on it. I don't think I have to explain this too much because for those our families who already have kids with NF and pain, we already feel this. But the thing about having pain is really interfere with your function. Up to 86% reporting how pain can be impacting their quality of life is very significant. It's a very serious problem. And pain can also physically cause decreased ability to do things. It can cause depression, anxiety. And there's many studies indicating there's interfering with cognition, and their implicit pain perception is impaired, and how they incorporate and cope with living with chronic pain is very difficult. Unfortunately, there was also studies indicating that in adults, there are a few percentage, I think it was like, 15% who needed to be in opioids, narcotics, except that 85% had said that it was not helpful. So addressing the chronic pain earlier on, avoiding such medication, I think is very important. Maybe some studies indicating that males may have higher pain interference. Some studies say the opposite, and maybe female with maybe more upper motor function interference. But regardless of their gender, the concern is these chronic pain can have impact in quality of life. So what do we do about this pain that can really impact our families and our children with NF? Number one is we have to figure out where is that pain coming from. It's majority of the time it could be multifactorial, so we need to put different things into context. So we'll have the interview trying to figure out, where could this pain coming from. And if we do identify plexiform neurofibroma, we'll talk with the NF team to see, about treatment options, whether this is something that we need to consider. And some of the things that I will intervene is, depending on the severity and the character of the pain, we'll discuss about having any medications. And, again, because it can impact motor function, we'll discuss about having, do we need to do other therapies such as physical therapy, occupational therapy to improve your motion abilities. And there's some studies indicating that complementary medicine, which is not specific for NF, can be effective. And there has been a study in the NF population that adults with chronic pain end up utilizing complementary treatment. So these are the options that we will discuss as entering our clinic. So quickly going over some of the medication. In adults, many of the patients actually report that utilizing Tylenol or acetaminophen or NSAIDs like Motrin, Advil, tends to actually help and at least help them go back to sleep. And this is, a number one easy treatment, easy access treatment. Obviously, it does have some side effects, but as long as you take, according to the guidance, the side effect is not too significant, and you can use it to really help some of the musculoskeletal pain. And if it's more topical, kind of similar concept with, what we had discussed about, there's different formularies of medicine that can be helpful to minimize side effects. So there's like patch form of it. There's also gel form of it that you can consider. Chronic patients with NF chronic pain also do report utilizing gabapentin or pregabalin type of medications, and it reduces release of neurotransmitter, which is excitatory to help with the pain regulation. And this ends up being one of our first-ish line of treatment because usually the medication is well tolerated. It is effective. Except that for our kids who are in school, the sleepiness and a little tired can be some of the interfering things. And, the thing about these medicine is it's science, but it's art at the same time. Like there's different ways to tailor the timing, the dosing. Maybe you take a little less during the daytime and you take a little bit more overnight. And, you don't try to cause a surge of gabapentin dose in your body, and you try to maintain steady state. All these small things we can work out to minimize the side effects, but these are the some of the side effects that we end up seeing. And very rarely, weight changes. I've never seen a child who ended up having swelling in their legs with gabapentin, and also I have seen, but some of those can be side effects. And again, gabapentin comes in multiple forms. It can be in capsule, liquid, and tablets, which you can cut, and things like that. Clonidine, it's a medication that was initially developed for hypertension treatment. So the side effect is, slowing down the blood pressure. But it works on the alpha receptor, which is autonomic system, and it kind of slows your heart rate down. And it also seems to help with your autonomic neurons to calm you down and decrease pain. The most common side effect with clonidine is you're feeling more sleepy, so we often will prescribe it at nighttime, so you are able to sleep with the clonidine and also address some of these neuropathic type of pain. It comes in tablets. You can formulate to liquid, although it's a little bit hard to get it from the pharmacy and patch. So again, depending on the type of pain and when it's interfered with your life, we'll kind of tailor in terms of what type of forms and what type of dosing we'll use for clonidine. Lidocaine patch is one of the patches I will actually use quite often in this clinic because it's just easy to access. You can just put it as needed. If you are really suffering from pain, of course, you have to consider pharmacologic things. But if it's here and there, you're still worried about some of the side effects, these patches are, with the less side effects. So our families, I feel like, have a little, it's easier to access them and be able to use them. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. You do need to put it on for 12 hours and take it off to minimize skin irritation. The good thing about this is you can put it on wherever you want, and then you can take it off, and you can sleep with it if it's worse at night. But it should last. The impact of the patch will last longer even after you take it out. I think with pain, again, being multifactorial, it's really important to look at the whole picture. So when I end up meeting your children, what I'll do is I'll do full musculoskeletal assessment, indicating do we have any lower tone or a weak on core, which is 9.9 out of 10 of the kids that I end up seeing. Do we need to work on those strengthening muscles? Do we need to work on focal musculoskeletal pain? Oftentimes your muscles are lower tone and you have different trigger points, and I recommend doing in-clinic injections or doing dry needling with physical therapy to release some of the muscle knots. And you can still have overuse because you are walking particular way, compensated way, because some of the weakness in your loading your particular joint too much and things like that. And some of our family will also have length discrepancy, related to the neurofibroma, one leg maybe a little bit bigger and the one leg a little smaller. So, that functional asymmetry and symmetry assessment would be helpful, and sometimes I'll recommend a little bit of a shoe insert, and that kind of addresses the symmetry, and the back pain feels much better, and you didn't even have to take any medicine for that. So, again, having that kind of holistic approach I think is really, really important. And also, again, not minimizing whenever your child reports or shows like, oh, this bothers me, this is hurting, something that we do need to take action. Just to quickly summarize, the treatment of any pain in this population with NF patients, it really depends on the location, severity, the cause, but it has to be holistic, which has been our message throughout this morning. In an ideal world, we also are teaching our kids with pain coping mechanism. Living with chronic pain more than 3 months is really burdensome for our kids who are already going through so much stress of going to see multiple doctor's appointments. They're struggling with school and, X, Y, and Z. So being able to cope with that is very important. Again, incorporating, therapeutic exercises. Maybe we do physical therapy. Maybe I give you a prescription for going out on ice skating, whatever that it is that we need to do. Orthotic considerations. A lot of our kids do have pronated feet and flat feet, like length discrepancy, so that's something that we can talk about. And then pharmacologic treatment, depending on the severity. So I'm going to move on to discuss about NF. I'm until 11:20. There's been more studies in adults and kids, but in adults with MF, they say 75% report having fatigue, which is very significant proportion of our patients. And there is multiple reasons for having fatigue. It can be cognitive, it can be physical, or it can be just not having enough rest, and it's higher than those without NF. And when they do have fatigue, sometimes we don't sleep well and we feel tired, we're tired. But their fatigue, when we say their fatigue, it's pretty severe using some of the skills that they had assessed. The cause of fatigue is not 100% clear. Again, the concept of multifactorial reason for having these is kind of the same with fatigue too. There were some studies from the endocrine perspective. Maybe there are some relationship with vitamin D deficiency, obesity and hypothyroidism, but everything is less than 30%. It's not easy to just say it's from the vitamin D deficiency or anything like that. We know that the sleep can be very difficult, and also muscle dysfunction causing fatigue. So, as a rehab doctor, muscles is like one body part that I, just love assessing and, getting to more. And studies in kids with NF shows that kids with NF have reduced strength. Most commonly to assess strength is grip strength, and they are much lower than typical kids without NF. And the pattern is not so clear, but some studies say maybe proximal muscles are a little bit more weaker, but there's generally absolute number of reduced strength in our kids. And dynamic muscle function, so when you are, trying to jump, you're, doing the running, that function is also impaired. And, for those who've already seen me in clinic, we talk about low tone a lot. They have lower tone and coordination. We will do assessment for coordination in our clinic, and those can be very difficult. And we think that it's that same pathway that gets impacted with pain as well that may interfere with muscle function. And so it indicates that the actual muscle mass or size is smaller. I know some of my parents I share that, I feel like my child's, leg looks too small, muscle looks too reduced. So, and that's evidence. We do, that's also in science, we do see that. And even the structure is changed, so it's not the same muscle that we're trying to, we're working with. So, we're starting off, in disadvantage for our kids. And, treatment of fatigue is definitely not easy because some of the things we cannot control, right? The muscle not being the same structure is hard to control. But some do indicate maybe if it's severe fatigue, we, consider endocrine workup. If it's hypothyroidism, maybe we need to work on the thyroid treatment. And muscle strengthening, I'll talk about it kind of at the end, some of the evidence on what type of muscle strengthening can be very helpful for our kids with MS. There's been studies on L-carnitine supplements, which I'm not really recommending in my clinic at this point because there's no phase 3 trial. That study in particular was looking at age between 8 to 12, given 1,000 milligrams daily, and they did see some strength improvement, in dynamic strength and endurance. So, more to come. And there's a study about whether whole body vibration therapy can be helpful for the fatigue, and that's also, there's clinical trial going on in Britain, to my knowledge. So, what we can do in the United States as of now is, depending on severity, consider endocrine referral and, counseling on what type of muscle strengthening we can do. And oftentimes I'll put it in the PT prescription, if that's what we end up doing, of adding plyometric exercises and consider vibration therapy if that's available in the center. So I'm going to kind of breeze through the hypotonia talk. A lot of our kids with MS are kind of fluffy lower tone. When they sit, they're kind of like this. It's hard for them to sit upright, not only because of ADHD, but because of lower tone. And the easy way to see it is when your child, when they're younger, when they're asleep, when you lift them up, they just kind of slip through, right? For our kids with MS, they're awake and you lift them up and they still slip through because they are very lower tone. And it's kind of confusing because is lower tone related to strength? Maybe, but it's hypotonia or lower tone is not something active that they can do. Some of the other manifestations would be they sit maybe in W a lot. Maybe, you have them stretch their fingers and things and they're can touch, and their elbow bend a lot, and their ankle rolls. Those are all kind of symptoms of having lower tone. We kind of talked about how this can impact maybe fatigue and pain, but because you're lower tone, it can be harder achieving some of the developmental things too. We'll talk about some of the secondary findings. So lower tone, it's a big normal curve in terms of when do we say this is abnormal lower tone and this is lower tone but still within normal. So it's not very clear cut, but so the treatment depends on the severity and which body parts that are involved and what impacts the function the most. When I hear about causing child to have a significant truncal tone, I will consider doing physical therapy to strengthen the core because you can strengthen muscle, and or consider doing suits like this to give a little bit of a sensory input to keep my patients upright. We look at feet a lot, and majority of the patients that I end up seeing in an NF clinic will either have flat feet or pronated feet. There are some studies indicating that as an adolescent to adult, this can cause ankle tightness where you're not able to fully dorsiflex your foot. So I tend to intervene pretty earlier on and, maybe consider over-the-counter shoe insert depending on the severity. If it's really impacting other parts of gait because many of my patients kind of block flat feet, then I'll consider doing small orthotics. For those who do not want to go through the orthotic route, we'll talk about a lot about, shoes. And you probably notice, depending on what shoes you wear, your ability to walk comfortably for a longer distance can really impact, your pain and, other joints and things like that. And the type of shoe I recommend for the lower tone ankle is having this shoe similar to this. I am not going to say the brand because I don't need to particularly purchase this one per se, but you can see how it goes all the way high up over the ankle, and it's kind of firm. So the idea is when you put the shoes on, and for those Converse lovers, that's not my favorite because they're too flimsy. But you want to have a kind of a firmer outer side, and usually the fall, winter is a great time to try out these shoes, and it does give you a little bit more support so you're not, rolling your ankles and giving a little bit more support. Scoliosis. So we know that scoliosis is higher, the prevalence is very high, up to, I don't think I have it here, but there's been studies saying that it's up to 80%, 90%, from 10 to 90. So meaning if you screen for it, you're gonna find it. So oftentimes we'll definitely do clinical assessment, but I will likely recommend doing an X-ray at one time just to see where we are with the baseline. But the scoliosis NF is not, complex again. It's not, typical idiopathic scoliosis where, depending on the curve, you do, brace and things. It could be related to the neurofibromatosis. You can have bony changes, dystrophic. So, anyways, number one step is recognizing whether you have scoliosis, and depending on the type of scoliosis, we'll intervene. My job as a PMNR is to kind of screen, and if you do have a pretty significant scoliosis, then I'll refer to orthopedics colleagues for further management. These are some of the distinctive scoliosis types you can get in NF population. And again, depending on severity, you may do TLSO or harder brace. We may end up needing to do the surgeries. And my favorite topic, exercising. I think from the morning till, ongoing theme of exercising, and hopefully you all got the pedometer, and, that's to count the steps. I have challenges exercising because I'm not great at time managing, but it's even harder for our kids with NF. Their social skills can be difficult. They already have pain, and trying to move when you have pain can be hard. Communicating, when you play sports, all that is very hard. Coordination, again, our kids with NF really have difficulty coordinating some of the movements and, getting all the things together to input whatever movement they need to do can be very difficult, on top of the weakness and poor endurance, the organic things that they're struggling. So I don't know that I need to, emphasize the benefit of exercising, right? Everybody knows, we all know that we have to exercise, including our kids with NF. Obviously, it's harder because our kids will have fatigue, and it's hard to, find that balance. But, by participating in some sort of exercise program, you do improve your muscle strength. You are stretching to prevent any secondary musculoskeletal contractures, improve posture, balance, coordination. And, we talked about how chronic pain can really impact their social life and their quality of life in that way. But being able to participate in sports, which is a right sport, because I know some of my kids with NF gets frustrated because they're not the one who's, doing the goal, they're not the VIP, right? But finding the right sports for them that can boost their confidence so that they can feel like they're part of a team is really important. With fatigue, if you let it rest too long, your stamina is going to only get worse, right? So you do want to continue to build stamina over time. And decreased pain and participation and quality of life, again, which is really important because we don't want our kids to feel isolated from the rest of the society and the world that they live in. So we have so many options for exercise, right? The number one step is home exercise, and I think it's really important that, as parents, we do it together. But, we'll often discuss about, okay, let's start with doing stretching because you do need to maintain good range and, to start off, and it's a good warm-up to doing whatever. We get a yoga ball and we start working on the core strength, whatever we need to do. Often we'll have a conversation, or if we don't have enough time, or if you wanted to talk to a specific, specific therapy, I'll refer to physical therapy or occupational therapy to just be able to go over some of the home exercise. And the idea is, right, you do physical therapy once a week or every other week, and you maintain that every single time, right? Yes, maybe it's great you find a physical therapy that can do physical therapy twice a week or 3 times a week, but it's a lot of work, right? Picking kids up early from school, driving there, doing 1 hour, coming back, it's a lot. So the idea is you are able to maintain this at home. And, we'll often talk about doing these therapies in school too, but with expectation that we're not expecting the school to have them participate in physical therapy 1 hour every single day. That just does not exist, right? It's mostly consultative, but we can kind of incorporate with work with school to talk about these exercise options. Maybe we do adaptive PE so that they're not just sitting out during PE, which we talked about. Adaptive sports, depending on where you guys live, there's always park recreation or community organization that you will have access to, and the Montgomery has it, DC has it, and those are relatively cheap options that you can sign up, and they accommodate adaptive sports. Communities like YMCA, they always adaptive swimming, if that's something that's easy access for you, and we will kind of figure out what other resources you guys have maybe easier for you to access. Different team sports for those kids who are very social, I think it's really important to be engaged. And I think what happens is you are, as a parent and as a kid with MS, you are so busy with doing, seeing this stuff or this stuff or this X, Y, and Z that I feel like some don't even have a chance to, take dance class, right? Which is something that many families will choose to do when, their kid turns 3 or 4. So kind of doing those things, I think, will be really important because oftentimes that priority goes down. And depending on your family, lifestyle, if you guys like going hiking, maybe we do more hiking on those things, because I think also kids learn from what the parents enjoy doing, right? And you don't always need to be like, okay, let's go to the gym and let's wait. It could be a lot of recreational activities where they're doing things and maybe they're distracted by watching all the other folks doing, whatever things that they're doing. And there's an option for private personal training, right? That is 1-to-1. We can talk about some of the goals and really work on some of these things. Something funny. All right. I think questions at the end, so I'll skip. Yes. Thank you.
I want to talk about neurofibroma, which I think is something that is both obvious in an NF1. It's part of the diagnostic criteria of NF1, but it can also be a little bit mysterious and honestly sometimes very scary for families to think about. And if you Google neurofibroma, cutaneous neurofibroma, classiform neurofibroma, you look at Google images, those pictures are horrifying. So I want to hopefully educate and kind of present some information that will make it a little bit less scary and more approachable. So we're going to talk about the 2 main categories of neurofibromas, the classiform neurofibromas and the cutaneous neurofibromas. But first, we're going to just kind of define what is a neurofibroma. So to understand that, we need to kind of take a step back to some anatomy. So we have on the left is what we call the central nervous system, and that's the brain and the spinal cord. And then on the right is the peripheral nervous system. So those are everything besides the brain and the spinal cord. So it's all the nerves that go to all the muscles and organs in our bodies that come out of the spinal cord. And neurofibromas are a disorder or a tumor type of the peripheral nervous system. So we're kind of zooming in even farther. this is a cartoon of a nerve, and the nerve is not just one thing. It's this bundle of fibers that's kind of encased in this sheath. And what happens, and just to kind of orient you to this picture, so the gray little spots there are the gray lines. These are the actual nerve fiber, the axons. And then you're kind of surrounded in this material called myelin. And what happens in a neurofibroma, now this is a cross-section of a nerve, and you have all these little myelinating cells, which basically give support to the nerve fibers. And that's normal to have there. You also have these inflammatory cells that are also normal to have inside of that nerve fiber. And what happens in neurofibroma is that you basically get overgrowth of multiple different types of cells within that fiber. So you get overgrowth of particularly the Schwann cells, which are the type of the cell that creates myelin. Myelin is like the insulation of the nerve. If you think of another analogy is if you think of like a wire, just a power cord, the myelin is like the rubber on the outside of the power cord. And so what happens in a neurofibroma is that rubber, that those Schwann cells get overactive and replicate when they shouldn't. And that kind of promotes all these other inflammatory cells to come in, these mast cells and fibroblasts that get in there, and you get this kind of morass of different cell types that causes the neurofibroma. But importantly here, a lot of times the actual nerve, the actual axon is not affected. So the axon is that wire that actually transmits the electrical signal. And so that axon, that wire doesn't always get affected. So a lot of times, what this means to families and to patients is that the neurofibromas usually don't cause symptoms because it's not actually a problem of the axon. It's a problem of all the stuff around it. But as we'll talk about, sometimes they can cause symptoms. And so all of the complicated biology apart, a neurofibroma is a definition. It's a benign tumor made up of nerve tissue along with other cells in there, inflammatory cells like mast cells, connective tissue cells, and blood vessels. And a question that we get a lot in clinic is like, what does it mean to have a benign tumor? What does that mean? Is it cancer? And the answer is no. A benign tumor is a tumor that grows slowly and that it doesn't invade other structures or spread to other parts of the body, in contrast to a malignant tumor. But at the same time, the word benign is actually a term that a lot of oncologists don't like because just the term benign makes it sound like it's all okay, but a lot of times these tumors can cause problems. And so in a lot of ways, even though they're not biologically malignant, they can be functionally impactful to patients. So the other question that we get is why do we get neurofibromas in NF1? And so that comes back to kind of the genetics of what NF1 is. So for the purposes of a neurofibroma, this is all about Schwann cells. The Schwann cells are the cells that produce that myelin, that insulation around the nerve. People without NF1 have two functional copies of the NF1 gene, which creates enough NF1 protein to help the cell function correctly. People who have NF1, by definition, every cell in their body is missing one functional copy of the NF1 protein or the NF1 gene. And what happens when you develop a tumor in NF1 is that you actually lose the second copy of the NF1 gene in just that cell. So when you're born with NF1, all the Schwann cells in your body are missing one, and then if they lose the second one, then you can get a neurofibroma. So that's why it happens in NF1. And then there's different types of neurofibromas. There are cutaneous neurofibromas and plexiform neurofibromas. The cutaneous ones are the most common ones. They happen anywhere where there's a nerve underneath the skin. And they can have different appearances and textures. That's a picture on the top right of one that would be a peduncular cutaneous neurofibroma that has a little stalk and then kind of this bulbous thing on top of it. Those are probably the least common type, especially in kids. to have that type of neurofibroma. A lot of them are these more flat or sessile or rarely the globular neurofibromas in young people. This gets to kind of the theme in NF1 with cutaneous neurofibromas, because if you Google NF1 and you look at Google Images, you see people with hundreds of neurofibromas. But you look at your child and they don't have any, or they have one, and you're not even sure if it really is a neurofibroma, it's this little bump. And the reason for that is that you usually don't get neurofibromas until you're older. It really picks up once you get into adolescence, and then those cutaneous neurofibromas tend to accumulate throughout life up through about age 50, and then after age 50 you don't usually get any more. There's a wide variation. A theme that we talk about in clinic a lot is that we don't have good ways of predicting what people's NF1 experience is going to be. And this is true for cutaneous neurofibromas too, in that we can't tell you that based on your genotype, so based on the gene change that your child has, what's their risk of developing more or less cutaneous neurofibromas. We don't have that information yet. We're hoping, as research continues to be done, to learn more about what the predictors are. But we can tell you that they do tend to come around puberty and accumulate over time. Why do they matter? Well, they're not malignant, they're not cancerous, they're not problematic in that kind of biologic way, but they can be bothersome and annoying. I mentioned the word mast cells. Mast cells is a type of inflammatory cell in the immune system that releases histamine and can cause itching. And so a lot of our patients respond well to having antihistamines if they have NF1 associated itching, because those cutaneous neurofibromas can release that histamine and cause itching. They can also just be physically annoying. If they catch on clothes, they can be tender when you touch them, or if they get bumped. And importantly, they can affect quality of life. So the response evaluation in neurofibromatosis and schwannomatosis group range is a really great group of clinicians and NF1 advocates, families with NF1 who work together to solve NF1-related problems. And they did a study looking at people with NF1. This was in adults with NF1 using what's called the skin deck survey. It's basically a questionnaire, 20 items or so, where they ask questions about pain, or how the neurofibromas or how the skin condition that these people are experiencing affects their pain and sleep and social life and other things. And unsurprisingly, there was a strong association between both the number and location of neurofibromas, where if you have a lot of cutaneous neurofibromas, the total skin deck score, where higher is more affected or more disruption to your quality of life, is higher. At the same time, if having neurofibromas in cosmetically sensitive areas like the face is also associated with an impact on quality of life. Something else that we talk about in clinic a lot, I think I've talked to some of you guys about it, is vitamin D and NF1 and that relationship with vitamin D and neurofibromas. Vitamin D is important for bone health, and for that reason it's important in NF1 to have adequate vitamin D levels. But there is some, I would say it's weak evidence that says that having higher vitamin D levels is associated with lower numbers of these neurofibromas. So really, it's kind of a win-win to make sure that the vitamin D levels are adequate and that you're taking vitamin D if you need it. The treatment options, symptomatic treatment, we talked about the antihistamines, cetirizine, loratadine are ones that we use commonly for that. If there's itching, just having moisturized skin can help with some of the symptoms. There's lots of surgical options, which I won't go into in a lot of detail today, but they range from actually excising the tumor or general anesthesia with a surgery to doing laser or other minimally invasive procedures if you have many neurofibromas. There is now, like in other areas of NF1, there is now medical treatment that's emerging. And this was a study that was done that Children's National was a site for, using a MEK inhibitor, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, called nutametinib. And what they did was they looked at 100 people, 199 people, adults with NF1, and had at least 10 cutaneous neurofibromas. and they applied this topical gel, this topical MEK inhibitor, for 6 months, once a day, to the affected areas, and their primary objective, which was the criteria they used to say this study was successful, was the percent of subjects with a greater than 50% reduction in how big their neurofibromas were. The target ones, and what they found is that they met their objectives. They think that this topical agent works, with some caveats. They had 34% of people in like the low concentration category responded, and then 44% in the higher concentration category responded. They had a pretty impressive placebo rate as well, so that's something to consider. But they did meet the primary endpoint for the trial. So this topical therapy is now moving on. This was a phase 2 trial, which is like the preliminary study that we do to say, like, does this work? It's a preliminary efficacy study. And now they're moving on to the phase 3 trial, which we're also hoping to open at Children's, and it will have a lower inclusion criteria down to, I think, age 12. So some of our patients could be eligible for this therapy. That said, it does have some side effects, especially with the higher concentration formulation. Mainly we're just related to applying it on your skin, some itching, some redness, irritation of the skin. Patients who were participating in the trial, many of them at least thought that things were stable, and many of them felt like things were better, regardless of the actual measurements of the tumor. They subjectively felt like their tumor burden was better. That's cutaneous neurofibromas. The other type of neurofibroma that we talk about in NF1 is plexiform neurofibromas. Cutaneous neurofibromas are just literally skin deep. They're involving the dermis and above. Plexiform neurofibromas are the ones that go deeper. Sometimes they do involve the skin, but by definition they have to go deeper, and they involve multiple nerve bundles, not just one. They tend to be larger. They tend to be diffuse. In medical school, they teach us that it feels like a bag of worms when you touch it. It's kind of like a soft mass that you feel underneath the skin. Unlike cutaneous neurofibromas, which develop over time as you get older into adolescence, the theory is that they're actually present. You're actually born with them. We just can't see them initially on either exam, or if we were doing MRI at a very young patient, we might not see them, and then they tend to grow over time. So who gets plexiform neurofibromas? These, as I said, are usually present at birth, but they may be too small to see. So the question is sometimes, can we do an MRI early on and just find them if you're born with them? And the answer is probably not, because they're so small, and they tend to pick up as you get older. They only affect about 50% of people with NF1 at most, and so many people with NF1 never will have a plexiform neurofibroma, and it's important to keep in mind. The other thing, like many things in NF1, we don't fully understand why they happen to some people, and if you have one, how we can predict who's going to have a rougher time with them, who's going to have more growth, versus people are going to have an easier course with plexiform neurofibromas. On the right here, the squiggly line chart, this is a study where they looked at people who had a diagnosis of plexiform neurofibroma, and then they had volumetric MRIs looking to see the volume of a tumor over time. And you can see that it's all over the place. Some people have a lot of growth, like 200% of growth over the course of a couple of years. Some people stay exactly the same, and some people rarely actually shrink. And so right now we don't have a good way of being able to predict that up front. The other thing on the bottom left here, to kind of orient you to what you're looking at, on the bottom x-axis here is the age. So as people get older, what's the percent change in the volume per year? So like how fast are these growing? And the key here is that as you get older, as you get into, especially out of the adolescent period into adulthood, they tend to stop growing. So this is really a problem that if you're going to have it, they're going to start growing during late childhood, early adolescence, and then kind of peter out. So why do we care? What's the importance of knowing about plexiform neurofibromas? Again, the caveat here is that they usually don't cause symptoms. The most common conversation that we have in clinic about them is like, you have it, it's there, it's not causing problems, let's watch it. that's the most common situation. But sometimes they can cause disfigurement. If you have one that's affecting the orbits around the eye, if you have one on the neck, that can cause problems with the way that people's self-image. Like other types of neurofibromas, they can cause itching. And depending on where they are, they can cause mass effects, so they can cause compression of the airway or other problems, and these are very, very rare complications of neurofibromas. But in theory, anywhere that any organ that it's next to, it can smush that organ and cause problems. So this is one of the reasons people who have plexiform neurofibromas to come to NF clinic. We recommend coming once a year so that we can check and talk about what symptoms people might be experiencing. And once a neurofibroma is identified, we work with the family and develop kind of like a plan for how often are we going to be looking at this tumor with the MRIs to make sure that we're keeping track of it, and educating families about what signs to look for if there are problems. But to reiterate, most of the time it's just we acknowledge it and it's just a monitoring thing. Again, I want to talk briefly about the kind of the rare but serious complication of having a plexiform neurofibroma, and that's something called a peripheral neurosheath tumor. So these are our tumors. This actually is a cancer. It's a malignant tumor that requires intensive treatment, and it's a difficult to treat cancer. But it is very rare, and it doesn't typically happen in young people. If it's going to happen, it tends to happen towards middle age. Is the most common time that it happens. The reason why I'm bringing it up is that these tumors, these malignant peripheral neurosheath tumors, tend to come from a pre-existing plexiform neurofibroma. So if you have a lot of plexiform neurofibromas, in theory you would be at a slightly higher risk of having one of these malignant peripheral neurosheath tumors. But 50% of people who have NF1 have plexiform neurofibromas, and only 10%, at most 10% of them are going to have malignant peripheral neurosheath tumors. And so just because you have a plexiform neurofibroma by no means that you're going to go on and develop one of these cancerous tumors. That said, this is one of the things that we teach in clinic is to look for red flags. These are signs that things could be kind of changing into that more malignant category. And that's rapid growth, so growing quickly, severe or persistent pain. So Dr. Shen talked a lot about pain. Pain is really common in NF1, and we want to address it. But pain alone, that's chronic, that's the same, that doesn't change in character over time or how bad it is, that is less concerning from this standpoint of an MPNST. The time that we get worried about the MPNST, especially in adolescence into young adulthood, is if you have a new persistent pain that you can't otherwise explain. That makes us want to go and look there with a scan and say, is something happening in that area of the body? And then any kind of new neurologic symptoms. This is a relatively new thing that at Children's we actually have been doing this for a long time. Our team, Dr. Bornhorst and Dr. Kim, Dr. Packer have done study. We're part of the original whole body MRI studies looking at if we do whole body MRIs in young people, can we help identify these tumors early so at least we know that they're there and can watch them over time. And actually just this past month, AACR, the American Association of Cancer Research, is now recommending that people with NF1 consider getting a whole body MRI as they're transitioning into adulthood in late adolescence. So at Children's, our recommendation is around age 16 is when we start talking to families about doing that MRI. If you have a low tumor burden on that MRI, so just a few small little neurofibromas, then your risk of having MPNST later in life, we think, there haven't been large studies confirming this, but we think that this makes you have a lower risk of having that MPNST later on. If, on the other hand, we see a lot of neurofibromas, or we see one that it concerns us, then we can at least say, okay, we know that it's there. We know if you have new symptoms of that area, we can follow it more closely. and we can set you up on a schedule of every 5 years, every 2 years, whatever. We can decide how often we're going to be scanning just that area to make sure that we're not missing any changes. One comment on that to say is I think one of the hardest parts about NF and the tumor side of NF is the uncertainty of it, which can be really, I just want to acknowledge that it's really difficult for families and for us. This is something that a lot of things in NF are things that could happen, probably won't happen to you or your child, but they could happen, and that produces a lot of stress and anxiety for families, and that's it's hard. And one of the things I think of as our role as NFologists, as your kind of medical home for NF, is that you let us do the worrying about this stuff. That by coming to clinic and letting us do the surveillance with you, that you let us think about that, so that you and your child can think about other things like living your life and all the other things that we're talking about today that really matter on a day-to-day basis. So when do we actually need to treat these neurofibromas? The traditional approach is if they're growing fast or if they're causing morbidity. Morbidity means symptoms, so pain, neurologic symptoms, issues with structures around where the neurofibroma is. That's when we pull the trigger and think about treatment. Before 2020, the only real option outside the clinical trial setting was surgery, and listening to everything I've said so far, a question that we would often get is like, okay, this thing has a potential risk for becoming cancerous later on, and it has a potential for causing symptoms later on. Why can't we just take it out as soon as we know that it's there? And the problem is it's hard. These things, they're on normal peripheral nerves these are affecting, and so if you take them out, then you're causing potentially a lot of harm to the surrounding nerves. If it's a nerve that's going to the arm, you could lose partial function of the arm or the part of the body where that nerve's function is. And so, actually, completely resecting these tumors is uncommonly an option for treatment. And we know that over time there's a risk for regrowth and problems from the surgery itself. And so we generally reserve surgery now that we have medical options for cases, for very specific cases where we think it's likely to be successful. This brings us to medical treatment, which I'll talk about in the next couple of slides. But before I do that this is something that is, again, kind of a plug for if you have one of these types of tumors, to go to a center that has experience, a multidisciplinary team that treats NF, including radiologists, surgeons, virologists, oncologists, because you really have to put a lot of heads together to decide the best treatment approach for these types of tumors because they're complicated. This is the only cell biology slide in the whole day, I think. So the NF1, the problem with NF1, the reason why you get tumors in NF1, I talked about kind of the genetics of it before. This is kind of the cell biology part of it. So the NF1 protein is basically like a brake on the cell. It normally what it does is prevents the cell from growing too much. It prevents the cell from growing or proliferating more than it biologically should. And what happens in NF1 is you basically lose that brake and you get overactivation of multiple proteins. But importantly, for this type of tumor, is something called MEK. And if you have overactivation of MEK, you go through a pathway where you get cell proliferation and tumor development. And so there's a whole class of drugs now called MEK inhibitors, which we use and have been proven in different settings to slow tumor growth, and NF1 specifically. So there's a study called the SPRINT trial, which Children's was a major contributor to, where 50 kids with NF, just to reiterate, this is in children, and this was kind of a special thing because we don't often see clinical trials that are only done in kids. A lot of times, drugs are first approved in adults, and then it kind of trickles down into the pediatric world. This is a special case because these, as I showed earlier in the slides, these tumors tend to be problematic in kids specifically, and so there's an impetus, there's an important there's a drive to find treatments that work for kids. And so there was several trials. This is the last trial that led to the FDA approval. where they used the selumetinib, which is the MEK inhibitor that is now FDA approved, in 50 kids, and they saw at least a partial response, which they defined as a 20% reduction in the tumor volume in 2/3 of kids. And really, this drug, this class of drug, this is specific to selumetinib, but this is true for other drugs in the same class, is that it really changes the natural history of this disease. So as medical professionals, this is a big deal to us and for families too. When we think about natural history is the course that a condition will take if you don't do anything about it. And for a long time, we couldn't do anything about plexiform neurofibromas besides taking them out. And by using this new medication, now we can kind of change that natural history and say, like, you don't need to have progression or growth of this tumor if it's causing symptoms. So you might ask, why don't we just give everybody selumetinib who has a plexiform neurofibroma? And the reason is because it's not a benign drug. It's not something that is completely harm-free. And when you're on it, you need to be monitored with labs and checking your heart, checking your eyes. It has some skin toxicity, so that can be annoying. In general, people tolerate it really well, but it's not something that should be taken lightly and pulling that trigger to do it, which comes back to that we really need to be multidisciplinary and collaborative with our different specialties in making a decision with families and choosing to treat or not. There are lots of other things in the pipeline, and some trials that we're going to be opening at Children's in the next, certainly the next 12 months, maybe the next 6 months. There's a trial that just finished that is headed for FDA approval probably in the next 6 months called neurofibromatosis, which is similar to selumetinib in how effective it is for these tumors. Other MEK inhibitors have also been studied and have shown some response. And then there's also non-MEK inhibitors. So what if you don't respond to a MEK inhibitor, or what if you have toxicity or side effects that really you can't tolerate? And so there have been studies in adults on cabozantinib, and there will be a study coming up that we'll have here using an antibiotic called nitroxaline for these types of tumors. And then the other kind of theme in oncology in general is that a lot of times tumors don't respond just to one medicine. Especially if you don't respond to just one medicine, could we do some sort of combination, hitting the same tumor to kind of two different pathways within the cell and see if we can get a better response that way? So those approaches are in the pipeline. So the last thing I'll talk about is prevention. So how do we talked a lot about treatment, but we talked about you shouldn't be treating everybody maybe with MEK inhibitor. You shouldn't be taking everybody's tumor out if they're not symptomatic. But what can we do to prevent these tumors from causing problems? So there will be a study opening here in the next before the end of the calendar year, looking at the selumetinib for asymptomatic children with NF1 and who have plexiform neurofibromas, and not just who have plexiform neurofibromas, but who identify to have one in high-risk areas, so next to the airway or pushing against other important structures in the body that we would consider high risk. And so the eligibility for this will be kids that are 1 to 8 years old who have NF1 but don't already have a known plexiform tumor. You will get a whole body MRI on those patients, and then if we find a plexiform neurofibroma that the study team feels is in a high-risk area, then we'll basically, outside of the trial setting, we would do nothing but watch that area. If they're not having symptoms, we would just watch it. And so the question of this trial is that what if we don't watch it? What if we give selumetinib early and hopefully prevent the tumor from growing or causing problems? So this will be a randomized trial where we'll randomize either getting selumetinib or not, and the outcome will be, can we prevent growth or symptoms from developing? That's in the works. The key points of this talk are that cutaneous neurofibromas, very, very common, almost never problematic, except for the annoyance of having them and sometimes the psychosocial effect of having them. Plexiform neurofibromas, less common,
usually asymptomatic, but sometimes can cause problems, and then very, very rarely can become cancerous later in life. And this is a very exciting time for patients and for clinicians and researchers in this field, because things are going to be changing. They've already changed the last 5 years. They will continue to get better. Our treatment options and approaches to these types of tumors will get better in the next 10 years. So there's a lot of room for hope in the NF oncology space. And that's it. Okay. Thank you.